Today for September 11, I've chosen 10 True Tales, Heroes of 9/11 by Allen Zullo. This is the cover. So, acknowledgements. I wish to thank the first responders featured in this book for their willingness to relive in personal interviews with me the dramatic and sometimes emotional memories of their heroic exploits. I am also grateful to Steve Retier of the Fire Department of New York's Public Affairs Office for his assistance. Now, this is the author's note. The first responders on September 11, 2001, firefighters, police officers, emergency medical technicians, and paramedics, as well as military officers and even many civilians, risked their lives to save people they didn't know. Every one of them is a hero. I wish I could write about all their personal stories of valor, honor, and sacrifice. Instead, I have written 10 stories that reflect the countless breathtaking acts of heroism that occurred inside the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a hijacked plane. For this book, I read hundreds of news accounts and transcriptions of radio transmissions, phone messages, emails, and oral histories from rescuers. Selecting a representative sample of these courageous people, I conducted personal lengthy interviews and asked each to relive the heart stopping moments when they risked their lives to save others. Some found it easy to recall their experiences, some found it difficult and emotional because one or more of their comrades had been killed. All persons profiled in this book shared a common trait: humility. None viewed themselves as heroes. Some said they were just doing the job they were trained to do, while others said they were just doing the right thing. All said that the real heroes were the brave first responders who sacrificed their lives in their valiant attempts to rescue others, the courageous everyday citizens who died trying to save co-workers, and the passengers and crew of a hijacked plane who thwarted the deadly mission of the terrorists on board. As paramedic Charles Sareka told me, all the real heroes died that day. The rest of us just did what we could. By their actions, the heroes of 9/11 gave us a window into the human heart. Because they were committed to the service of their fellow man, they were willing to face death and take dangerous chances in their single minded goal of saving others. The triumphs of these brave heroes should be recognized not only by those whose lives were spared, but also by all of us. Their examples can offer us motivation to become the heroes of our own story, of doing what's right no matter the risk. Each of us possesses an inner strength that is often left untouched, but it's ready to be tapped if we so choose. When we face a family crisis, an extraordinary circumstance, a perilous situation, a moral dilemma, that's how heroes are made. The heroes of 9/11 mined their personal inner strengths. When you read the gripping accounts of their gutsy actions, you'll see that they displayed an intense boldness that spurred them to reach far beyond their personal limits. Their stories are written as factual and truthful versions of their recollections, although some of the dialogue can be recreated. This book is a salute to those who put their lives on the line every day: firefighters, police officers, and members of our armed forces, as well as to those who are called by fate to risk everything for a greater good. So the table of contents includes Attack on America on page 1, the World Trade Center on page 9, We Can't Abandon Her on page 12, Get Everybody Out Now on page 35, Don't Jump, We're Coming on page 53, Where Do I Begin to Look on page 69, Oh No, Not Again on page 85, If You Die Here, We All Die Here on page 98, The Pentagon on page 119, It's Us or Nobody on page 136, Follow My Voice, I Know a Way Out on page 154, United Flight on page United Flight 93 on page 166, and Okay, Let's Roll on page 168. We are going to start with Attack on America. On September 11, 2001, the United States and the world changed forever. In the bloodiest day on American soil since the Civil War, 19 members of the radical Islamic terrorist organization Al Qaeda hijacked four commercial jetliners and turned them into weapons of death and destruction. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 was deliberately crashed into the 110-story North Tower of the World Trade Center (WTC) in New York City. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 plowed into the Twin South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 smashed into the Pentagon, the nation's military headquarters near Washington, D.C. A fourth hijacked jet, United Airlines Flight 93, was aiming for the U.S. Capitol or the White House, but the courageous passengers and crew rebelled. At 10:02 a.m., during their desperate attempt to overpower the terrorists, the plane crashed in Pennsylvania, 20 minutes short of its intended target. By the end of the day, 2,995 people were dead, and the world was in shock. The plot to attack America was hatched by radical Muslim Khalid Sheikh Mohammed of Kuwait. It was approved by Al Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden, whose terrorist organization was based in Afghanistan. Their hatred for the United States was, and still is, fueled by their opposition to America's foreign policies. Under Mohammed's guidance, 19 young Muslim fundamentalists spent 2 years training for the deadly mission. Many of them had visas allowing them to live in the United States and take flying lessons. Armed with smuggled knives and box cutters, the hijackers looked like ordinary passengers as they boarded the four jetliners. Once the planes were airborne, the terrorists took control of the aircrafts in coordinated suicide assaults. They chose coast to coast flights because those planes carried large amounts of fuel and could cause the biggest explosions on impact. The enemy targeted the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center in the New York's financial district because the structures were mighty symbols of commerce. An estimate 14,000 workers were in the towers when they were attacked. The first plane crashed into the north side of the North Tower, 1 WTC, between the 93rd and 99th floors, setting the upper floors ablaze. Thousands of workers, including victims suffering from serious burns, began making an orderly evacuation down the building's three stairways. At impact, however, most of the tower's 99 elevators were rendered useless, trapping hundreds of people. Meanwhile, people in the South Tower, 2 WTC, began leaving. At first, most everyone assumed that this was a horrible accident, but then the second plane struck the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floors, igniting another colossal high rise fire. That's when everyone realized the United States was under attack. Office equipment, glass, and people were sucked out the windows and rained down on the streets below, along with parts of planes and other debris. An estimated 600 people were on the floors where the plane struck and were likely killed instantly. At least 1,500 workers survived the crashes but were unable to escape the buildings because they were trapped above the impact areas. As the fires raged with no hope of rescue, an estimated 200 people leaked to their deaths rather than die from the flames. Thousands of firefighters and 200 units, half the fire department of New York City, FDNY, and thousands of officers from the New York Police Department, NYPD, as well as off duty first responders, spread to the chaotic scene. Firefighters, many wearing more than 100 pounds of gear, and other rescuers rushed into the burning towers. They began the torturous climb up the stairs of New York's two tallest buildings, boldly trying to save anyone they could. Thousands were helped out safely, but the steel girders holding each floor began to soften from the heat of the flaming jet fuel until they could no longer bear the load. At 9:59 a.m., after burning for 56 minutes, the South Tower collapsed. 29 minutes later, the North Tower came crashing down. The astonishing, life-crushing, earth-shaking collapses killed almost everyone still inside. Co-workers, workers and rescuers. Massive, powerful clouds of choking dust and pelting debris roared through the streets, engulfing thousands of people who had already fled the towers. The falling rubble destroyed or seriously damaged other buildings in the complex. The nearby 47-story office building, 7 WTC, caught fire and collapsed later that afternoon at 5:21 p.m. Miraculously, 20 people trapped inside the WTC buildings were rescued after the collapses, but the WTC attacks claimed the lives of 2,605 people, not including those on board the aircraft. Among the casualties, 411 heroic first responders were still trying to rescue people when the towers came down. The FDNY lost 343 members, the most of any fire department in the history of firefighting. The Port Authority Police Department suffered the greatest single day loss of life in law enforcement history when 37 officers from every rank were killed. The NYPD bore law enforcement's second worst death toll that day with 23 casualties. An additional 8 emergency medical technicians, EMTs, and paramedics were from private emergency medical services units also died. While the Twin Towers were burning, the third hijacked plane swooped down and crashed into the west side of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The impact killed 125 persons, including 55 military personnel, and caused a fierce fire that caved in a wedge of the enormous building. After United Flight 93 was hijacked over western Pennsylvania, the passengers and crew learned from on-board phone calls to loved ones about the WTC and Pentagon attack. While the Twin Towers were burning, the third hijacked plane swooped down and crashed into the west side of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The impact killed 125 people, including 55 military personnel, and caused a fierce fire that caved in a wedge of an enormous building. After United Flight 93 was hijacked over western Pennsylvania, the passengers and crew learned from on-board phone calls to loved ones about the WTC and Pentagon attacks. Knowing the terrorists on board were on a suicide mission to destroy another national landmark, the captives rose up against them in a spontaneous rebellion that ended when the jetliner crashed in near field Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Like the three earlier hijacked planes, no one survived. The four doomed flights claimed the lives of 246 passengers and crew members, in addition to the 19 terrorists. Fearing more assaults, officials immediately shut down New York City's bridges, tunnels, and airports, as well as museums and major skyscrapers like the Empire State Building. Then the order went nationwide. The Sears Tower in Chicago was evacuated, as were colleges and museums. Disney World shut down, Major League Baseball canceled its games, and nuclear power plants went to top security status. The thousands of commercials and private planes that were still in the air were ordered to land at the nearest airport. The United States quickly determined that the perpetrators were from Al Qaeda. Leader Osama bin Laden and his fellow fanatics were based in Afghanistan, where they had set up a network of camps to train radicals to carry out terrorism in other parts of the world. That country was under the control of the Taliban, a fundamentalist Islamic militia that had seized power in 1996. The Taliban granted Al Qaeda protection in Afghanistan's desolate mountains. 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, the United States demanded that the Taliban turn over to the U.S. All the leaders of Al Qaeda immediately closed every terrorist training camp and round up all of Afghanistan's terrorists and their supporters. The Taliban refused. So, on October 7, 2001, the United States and several allies called coalition forces launched Operation Enduring Freedom and invaded Afghanistan. Within 3 months, coalition forces, spearheaded by the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, toppled the Taliban government, destroyed Al Qaeda training camps, and drove most of the militants into the Hindu Kush mountain bordering Pakistan. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured in 2003 and, as of early 2011, awaits trial on nearly 3,000 murder charges. Although many of Al Qaeda's top leaders were killed or captured during this time, Osama bin Laden managed to escape and, from a secret location, urged terrorists around the world to attack Western countries. The United States has been battling the Taliban and Al Qaeda sympathizers in Afghanistan ever since the invasion. It has turned into the longest shooting war in American history. On May 1, 2011, nearly 10 years after the attacks, an elite U.S. counterterrorism team of Navy SEALs stormed a heavily fortified compound near Islamabad, Pakistan, and killed bin Laden, the most wanted man in the world. The team swooped into the compound in a daring nighttime helicopter raid, triggering a fierce 40-minute firefight that ended in bin Laden's death. The troops identified his body and then buried him at sea. Since September 11, 2001, life has changed but goes on. Security at airports and at public and private buildings and events has tightened considerably because of the 9/11 attacks. At the WTC site, which became known as Ground Zero after the attack, the process of cleaning up the rubble and recovering human remains and personal items went on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 8 months. A new WTC complex is now under construction. In 2006, a sleek 52-story office building was completed where 7 WTC once stood. Scheduled for completion in 2013 is the 102-story 1WTC, which will soar to 1,776 feet, a height chosen to honor the year of America's independence. It will be about 400 feet taller than the Twin Towers. Several other buildings are being constructed, including the National September 11 Memorial and Museum. The damage to the Pentagon was cleared and repaired within a year of the attacks. The remodeled wedge contains the America's Heroes Memorial and a chapel at the spot where Flight 77 crashed into the building. Erected next to the Pentagon is a permanent outdoor memorial to the 184 people killed in the building and on the plane, not including the 5 hijackers. Near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the Flight 93 National Memorial Park and Tribute Center opened its doors in 2011 on the 10th anniversary of the attacks. September 11, 2001 will forever be etched in the souls of Americans. It was a day bloodied by terror and tragedy, but it was also a day of courage and character. The minutes and hours immediately after the horrifying attacks saw unbelievable acts of bravery by first responders and ordinary citizens who rushed into harm's way to save countless lives. In one of history's most inhuman moments, it is the humanity of heroes that will forever be remembered. Wow. So that was the first tale of Heroes of 9/11 by Allen Zullo. Stay tuned for the next read.